strategies. I've had sort of an off and on love and hate relationship with these posting boards, etc. Used to participate in Usenet, the early days, the rec gambling sports, and then got tired of it, so much flaming going on, and didn't do it for years. Now, every now and then, I like to take a look at those posting boards. And I know it's going to sound condescending in many respects. It is, but to see how the square player thinks. You know, the Paul Saltzmans of the world, the guy who has, about 4 billion posts on about 10 posting boards and does nothing but make condescending comments and really show what a square player he is. And even as recently as today, I saw somebody on actually one of the more respected and civil posting boards say, it's March. It's the toughest time of the year for the bettor. The lines get tighter. Sorry, folks, that is absolutely, positively false. But one of the reasons the square player believes that is if you use your November and December and January and any of your regular season techniques come the conference tournaments, that's where you are going to give your money away. The parameters change big time in the postseason conference tournaments, and you have to be aware of that in order to exploit it. Now, if you've been a fan of mine for a long time, and I know a lot of you are, going back to our score phone days, remember our golden rule, probably our number one golden rule of the college football and college basketball postseason. Neutral games are just that. They're neutral games. They are not, absolutely positively not, road games for both teams. And too often the square player who actually does do some research, he overanalyzes road stats for one team versus the road stats for the other team when handicapping neutral games. The odds makers know this. They must adjust. I can tell you one of the top angles in conference handicapping, and again, we define systems as something that can be objectively measured. For example, a double-digit favorite off a double-digit loss. Now, relatively objectively measured. I realize lines vary, so sometimes this game might fit into a system, sometimes it wouldn't. But because we say that a system has to have a Z rating of at least 4.5 or higher, or be about 80 units or higher to really be statistically significant, those slight variances don't make a big difference. Meanwhile, an angle is kind of like a system, but the parameters are much more subjective. And I will tell you, based on that definition, anyway, one of the top quote-unquote angles in conference play is Team A has a much better road splits than Team B. But Team A also travels significantly further than Team B to the neutral site. Team B is going to cover anywhere from 60 to 70% of the time, depending on other factors and depending on exactly how strong that angle is. So there is such thing as actually a regional court advantage where teams are playing much closer to the home court than the other. And again, not etched in stone parameters, basically close would be about 50 miles. Doesn't mean if it's 48 miles it fits into it. It's 52 miles it doesn't fit into it. Approximately 50 miles, and teams that have to travel far where they might be at a disadvantage, usually about 175 to 200 miles. But again, I cannot stress enough, use that dictionary as a handicapping tool. The neutral game is neither a home game nor a road game. Now, another one of those big differences during the regular season, we like those Adrian Barbeau type teams. In other words, teams that are top heavy, that have the best starting five, that have the best 1-2 punch, the best 1-2-3 punch, etc. But in the postseason, when it comes to the conference tournaments where teams are playing back to back to back, sometimes even 4 days in a row, depth becomes more important. Now, it's an assumption, and not necessarily an accurate one, that the best teams have the best depth. It can be a case where a team like, Temple, in their glory years under John Chaney, would always be a little bit top-heavy. They didn't go very deep, while other teams, like Tulane in some of their heydays, or Arkansas, obviously, when they had their 40 minutes of hell, they were very deep teams. So the teams that their strength is depth are generally going to do better in the conference tournaments. And that doesn't mean just on the second and third day, but also on the first day when coaches are, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, thinking ahead, trying to look at the bigger picture, and sometimes buy some time, buy some rest for some of their frontline players. And another one of our golden rules where recent play isn't defined by equal number of games. Like a lot of people think recent play means either 3 games back or 5 games back. Recent play means the same number of days. For example, how was a team done in the last week? How was a team done in the last 5 days? So in conference play, the recent games weigh much more heavy in our handicapping than they would during the regular season. If an overachieving team hit, 60% from the field the night before, they want to get right back on the court. So if they had a week between games or 3 days between games, that's where they could cool off. But playing in back-to-back nights, the recent play is much more important than it is during the regular season. That's when we really study the previous night's box scores when teams are playing these back-to-back and sometimes back-to-back-to-back situations. Not just bench scoring, but really the total bench minutes and how much were those minutes spread out. And it's good to read the respected summaries of the local papers where it will tell you where, a certain player may not have necessarily done well in the box scores, but did well playing defense, setting picks, etc. So the depth in the previous night's box scores are so much more important in March. That's just another specific example of where you can't use your regular season techniques in the conference play. Also, in the bigger conference, the so-called BCS, I know BCS is a football term, but we loosely use it also in basketball as well. The major conference teams. When you have teams that are essentially locked in as number 1 and number 2 seeds, be careful. A lot of these teams read between the lines. Coaches will say, we'd like to win this tournament, but it's really more important to be rested for the NCAA tournament. Teams that are virtual locks as a number 1 or a number 2 seed, we almost always put a check mark in the column of probably fading that team as a big favorite early on in their tournaments. Also, the conference tournaments mean new beginnings, psychological beginnings. Underachieving teams, we generally like to put a check mark in the positive column. Overachieving teams, we put a check mark in the column as possibly fading them. Now, this is an evergreen video. This video was true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, probably will be true 5 years from now, 10 years from now, although various parameters do change a little bit. But as an example, here in 2010, 2011, a good example would be Michigan State. We're going to take a look at all factors, but Michigan State is a team that could be on the uprise. They've underachieved all year. They get that psychological new beginning. They are a good example team that just jumps out as a potential dark horse team. And that is really when our preseason notes actually become more important in March than they were in January and February. So the single most important thing is handicapping techniques really change in March. Also, use to your advantage the competition among the sports books. Sports books are competing against each other to come out with lines earlier and earlier, and that's when we really like to surf the Google News. We get very little sleep during March. We'll take a look at the write-ups from the respected hometown newspapers the night before. Get these little tidbits that are going to come out after the lines are posted. So the competition among the sports books is an advantage to the sharp player. Well, again, you want all the best March Madness picks? It's going to be at offshoreinsiders.com.